What you see on the screen is Professor Galin Tihanov, a very good friend of mine, as well as an internationally renowned scholar. First of all, of course, as a matter of very important formality, let me just give a very brief introduction of Professor Galin Tihanov. Professor Galin Tihanov is the George Steiner Professor of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London and recurrent invited Professor of Intellectual History at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He's the author of 5 books and co-editor of 11 volumes of scholarly essays. His most recent book is The Birth and Death of Literary History. Birth and Death of Literary Theory, Regimes of Relevance in Russia and Beyond, published in 2019, which won the 2020 AATSEEL Edzil Prize for Best Book in Literary Scholarship. Professor Tihanov has held visiting appointments at universities in Europe, North and South America, and Asia. His work has been widely translated. He is elected member of Academia Europaea and co-winner of the 2012 Effin Etkin Prize. He is currently completing Cosmopolitanism, a very short introduction, commissioned by Oxford University Press. We have been trying to invite Professor Tihanov to Taiwan, actually, to give a talk on site. But it was right before the pandemic started. And so, the whole thing has to be stalled. Until recently, we have more or less mastered, organizing activities online. So we're happy that he also has the time for us. He will be speaking today on the topic, Two Types of Cosmopolitanism. I'm sure, many of you in the audience are very well acquainted with this topic of cosmopolitanism. And in today's world, especially this, is probably one of the most urgent issues. When Kant first formulated the idea of cosmopolitanism, he had world peace in mind. A world peace which is based on, showing equal hospitality to all people from, people across the world, and in which, all peoples can have dialogues, free dialogues on an equal footing. And I think what we see as happening today actually seems to have pushed that ideal beyond the horizons. So I think it's more urgent than ever that we need to really think about this topic. And as we just saw in the introduction, Professor Tihanov is recently working on this book called Cosmopolitanism, a brief introduction. I'm sure what he's going to talk about today is his most recent scholarship. So without further ado, let's give Professor Tihanov a big and warm welcome. Please, over to you, Galin.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I wish to begin with thanks to Dean Liao for the invitation, and to everyone at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the National Taiwan University for hosting this lecture. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be with you today, and I only regret we can't do this in person. But hopefully someday in the future, this would become possible once again. Now, today's talk, some of that comes from my new book that I'm working on right now. And There are also some examples that I'm still considering whether they would play a part in the book. But as my very good colleague and friend, Professor Liao, mentioned, cosmopolitanism is a highly contested idea. And it is also true that it is an idea of Western provenance, and it has a Western ideological baggage attached to it. And I will try to touch upon this in the talk. What I'm interested in today is to offer a differentiation between, I think there is some background noise. Probably not everyone is muted, but that is not an issue. So what I will do today is to offer a differentiation between two different types of cosmopolitanism. One that I call cultural cosmopolitanism, and the other one which I term political cosmopolitanism. This seems to me extremely of extreme importance, because we tend to work with a slightly homogeneous and undifferentiated notion of cosmopolitanism, and this is largely to our detriment. Now, if you review the literature on cosmopolitanism that has been mushrooming, particularly in the 1990s and early in the 21st century, you would see that it is occupied largely with questions of politics, and it is written by political philosophers and political scientists, which means that we have been largely equating the project of cosmopolitanism with a swathe of political projects. But the history of cosmopolitanism reveals a much more complex picture, in which there are these two different impulses and these two different understandings of cosmopolitanism, which intersect in various significant ways, but are far from identical. Before I begin with a brief exploration of the first of these two types of cosmopolitanism, cultural cosmopolitanism, let me maybe offer a working definition of cosmopolitanism. I see cosmopolitanism as a body of discursive practices that assists us in extending the field of possible validation of our shared humanity beyond the cultures in which we operate. And this already is a definition that insists both on cultural aspects and on political aspects. If you look at this very early pronouncement by Diogenes, who calls himself a citizen of the world, these two aspects are also there in the word citizen, but also in the ancient idea of the cosmos, which has to be something ordered, which has to display a certain harmony as an antidote to chaos and disorder. There is a certain beauty ingrained in this notion of the cosmos that the Greeks had. If you look at the word cosmetics today, it has the same root as the Greek cosmos. and it still has the ring of this beautification that is at stake in this ancient idea of the cosmos as a site of certain order and harmony. So it is very important to understand that cosmopolitanism works by retaining always, at all times, a notion of difference. And this is what distinguishes cosmopolitanism from universalism. Cosmopolitanism doesn't have this drive towards homogenizing things or universalizing our respective pictures of the world. It is based, it is grounded in a notion of difference, and it proceeds from that notion of difference. And to give you a preview of my main argument today, I believe that this is the crucial shared ground between cultural and political cosmopolitanism. They both work with a notion of difference and proceed from a notion of difference. What divides them is how they handle difference. And what I wish to claim today is that cultural cosmopolitanism works by embracing and actually celebrating difference, whereas political cosmopolitanism seeks to relate to difference in a way that tones it down, that gradually thins out and diminishes its significance. But the starting point for both types of cosmopolitanism, cultural and political, is the acknowledgement of difference. I will now begin to share with you my PowerPoint, and we will start a little bit in some detail. Let me see if I can now make this work. So I hope you all see it now. And if so, let me just go to my first slide. As an archetypal figure of cultural cosmopolitanism, I've chosen Herder, who, as you know, is a contemporary of Kant. What is more, Herder was a student of Kant. For some years, he would attend some of his lectures. And he is an exemplary work of what I term cultural cosmopolitanism. Herder's anthology, which he published in his lifetime, and then very soon after his death, a second edition appeared, which was slightly augmented. And here to the right, you see the second edition, which the script, as you can see, is that of the what is known as fracture, or colloquially Gothic script. And in the middle, you see a modern edition of this anthology. Now, the standard or the correct English translation of the title is Voices of the Peoples in Songs, sometimes inaccurately and indeed erroneously translated into English as Voices of the Nations in Songs. But I will come to this point a little bit later. Now, the first thing I think we need to talk about here is this decisive and repeated plurality that the title captures. Voices, peoples, songs. Now, this is this is a true manifestation of cultural cosmopolitanism, this anthology, not just because it goes beyond Europe in the samples it includes, but also because Herder stakes out this major question: how do we appropriate other cultures? How we make sense of them? How do we dialogue with them without extinguishing what is unique about them? And how do we, in other words, handle their difference from our own culture? And this is a huge problem to this day. How do we accomplish these cultural transfers without leveling out the difference that is constitutive of other modes of writing and other modes of creativity? But of course, from a perspective of a largely Eurocentric notion of culture and cosmopolitanism, there is also another very important question. How do we accomplish these cultural transfers while retaining the constitutive difference of the texts that we appropriate, without at the same time exoticizing them, without letting this seminal sense of difference tip over into a notion of exoticism? And this is an early gesture of cultural cosmopolitanism that Herder accomplishes in this very important anthology. Why cultural? Cultural because it is focused on culture, and language is very central to this first type of cosmopolitanism. And the entire problem of how we relate to the question of one's first language, to the question of multilingualism, to the question of bilingualism is absolutely crucial in understanding how cultural cosmopolitanism functions, which is not to say that cultural cosmopolitanism stipulates that monolingual humans cannot be cosmopolitan. We will return to this point later when I go through a number of other examples. The second major aspect of cultural cosmopolitanism is the way it handles difference. And my claim here is that cultural cosmopolitanism subsists on not merely acknowledging difference, but proactively embracing and celebrating it. Sometimes, of course, this celebration assumes the more controversial contours of radical of affirmation, which can indeed generate secondary commodification and exoticism and actual estrangement from the text or the artifact. But cultural cosmopolitanism does indeed work not just from the premise of there existing an important difference, but by actually celebrating, embracing, and promoting this difference. And this is crucial in capturing its essence. Now, a few more words on the title, and then I will move to a discussion of political cosmopolitanism. Now, as you can see, the title sustains this notion of plurality throughout. And there are three important elements here. The first one is this word songs. This is a word that a Chinese speaking and Chinese reading audience would have no problem understand, because behind this word at the end of the 18th century in Europe, there are two meanings that need to be discerned. One is the European equation until about the early 19th century of literature largely with poetry. And song here is a synonym for poem, because there was this belief in Europe into the 19th century that the most representative genre of literature is poetry, and poetry occupies the top spot in the hierarchy of genres. Now, this, of course, is not very dissimilar from the Chinese aesthetic tradition, where classical Chinese poetry, of course, also would have the upper hand for thousands of years, and the fictional genres of prose writing would be seen for a very long time as non-canonical, in some sense even substandard. But the second meaning behind this word song is Herder's insistence that verbal creativity, and this is a very modern view when we situate this vis-a-vis our concerns today, Herder would be adamant that verbal creativity should not be reduced to the written word, that verbal creativity expands much further to encompass folklore, and this is what we need to read behind this word song as well. And the importance of folklore here is also registered in this very important word peoples. And this is why it is incorrect to translate this as nations, as is often done in English, because Herder was very clear that we need to acknowledge acts of verbal creativity that precede national cultures and the formation of various nationalisms and nation states. He was clear that nations are historical products, and that communities all over the world often for a very long period of time live an existence, a very productive aesthetic life, without being nations, let alone nation states. And of course, all of this now also helps us explain this crucial first word, voices. These voices are distinct, they are plural, and cultural cosmopolitanism is about letting them sound in their difference, and not let them be substitutable and exchangeable with one another. Of course, Derrida would have made hay with this word, finding it to be an excellent example of both logo and phono centrism. Let me perhaps move now to political cosmopolitanism and try to talk a little bit about the difference between cultural and political cosmopolitanism. I should also add something very important here about cultural cosmopolitanism. Cultural cosmopolitanism tends to bracket out the immediate impact of factors related to power. And the agent of cultural cosmopolitanism is usually the individual. Of course, we know that when the individual sits in his or her room reading an anthology or watching a film, the power factors and the larger social context cannot be switched off. But cultural cosmopolitanism tends to adopt this liberal posture of empowering the individual to communicate directly with another culture, as if there is no mediation grounded in power and in larger social factors. Let me now move to political cosmopolitanism. And as Professor Liao mentioned, the thinker who is the classic reference point here is indeed Kant, because it is with Kant that cosmopolitanism becomes political. A sphere of thinking about cosmopolitanism exclusively in cultural terms. Now, political cosmopolitanism is everything that cultural cosmopolitanism is not, because look at this crucial difference. Political cosmopolitanism is language neutral. Language is in Kant's work, or in most of the work on political cosmopolitanism after Kant, because political cosmopolitanism is about formulating principles of relating to the other, acknowledging the difference, and I will explain this in a moment, that are supported by a range of very clear legal measures and very clear political arrangements. Now, if you look at Kant's most important work here, and again, you can see the first edition of 1796. This is really the time when Herder works on his anthology. And in the middle, you can see the modern German edition. Again, there are two different English translations. One is simply called Perpetual Peace. And the other one, which I think is better, is Towards Eternal Peace. And I think Towards Eternal Peace is better, not just because it has a preposition, and which signals that this is a process, that this is an aspiration. And there is a dynamic, a certain dynamic to this process, but also because it signals the philosophical background to this work, which gets slightly lost in Perpetual Peace. And the philosophical background here, of course, is Kant's transcendental philosophy of clearly Christian provenance. And before Kant, this is very important to realize, there are a number of projects in Europe of eternal peace, and they're all religion-based projects that begin by installing peace amongst the Christian peoples of the world, first Europe and then beyond. So look at this word eternal, and you would get a sense of this transcendental foundation of peace. But when you read Kant's essay, this idea is largely displaced by this very pragmatic political view, which takes peace to be the precondition for the implementation of what Kant defines and calls the cosmopolitan law. And the word he uses for cosmopolitan here is weltbürgerlich, which is the German word. During his time in German, you could also use the Latin-derived word cosmopolitisch, written with a C at the time, not with a K, unlike in modern German. Now, let me first of all state my main argument here. Political cosmopolitanism differs from cultural cosmopolitanism, not just because it's language neutral. This is already a very important difference. Political cosmopolitanism differs from cultural cosmopolitanism because it acknowledges difference, like cultural cosmopolitanism. It proceeds on the basis of having to confront this difference, but unlike cultural cosmopolitanism, it seeks to attenuate this difference and to accommodate it in a regime of handling difference and otherness with a slightly more universal intent, to quote Kant. Let me first demonstrate how Kant locates difference and how Kant retains this notion of difference throughout his essay. Crucial here is the distinction he makes, very clear distinction, and he insists on this, between, on the one hand, international law, and on the other hand, what he calls cosmopolitan law. Now, international law, of course, is the law that regulates the relations between different states. And therefore, law at the moment of implementation considers these states as its equal subjects. Cosmopolitan law, Kant says, is very different. It regulates not the relations between different states. It regulates the relations between a state and an individual who is not a citizen of that state. Now, that citizen is clearly someone who is a foreigner, someone who has turned up at the border and is knocking on the door of that other state. Now, here is the difference. Of course, this difference is also cultural, because that foreigner usually would speak a different language. That foreigner, in some cases, would be praying to other gods. that foreigner would have different customs and would be coming equipped with different sensitivities and different traditions. But this is not what interests Kant. And this is implied, but not foregrounded in the essay. The essay is really interested in a different type of difference here, in a very different notion of dissimilarity, which is not primarily cultural, but is a political difference, because it is a difference in status, and therefore a difference in power. The person who knocks on the door of another state without being its citizen is, of course, endowed with fewer rights and privileges, if any, compared to the citizens of that state. And there opens up this huge gap here, which is constitutive of all future discourses of exile, the gap between the human being and the citizen, which is problematized by Hannah Arendt, by Kristeva, and just about anybody else who writes about this, including, of course, Agamben, who is hugely indebted to Hannah Arendt on this count. So this is how political cosmopolitanism conceives of difference, not primarily through a cultural prism, but through the prism of rights, and through the prism of the legal status, which is profoundly different. And Kant's cosmopolitan law is designed as a tool of attenuating this difference, continuing to acknowledge it throughout, but attenuating it. And how does he do that? What does he propose? He proposes the well-known principle of what he calls universal hospitality. And I do want to dwell a little bit on this principle, because it is very important in understanding how political cosmopolitanism works. The first thing to arrest our attention here is this adjective universal. And you can see already this very strained relationship between cosmopolitanism, political cosmopolitanism, I insist, and universalism. So the principle that Kant wishes to formulate here has to be a universal one. But does this mean that the notion of difference disappears? No, it doesn't. It remains constitutive throughout, because this principle is the principle of, yes, universal, but on the other hand, hospitality. Now, hospitality is a difficult notion here, because, of course, it implies friendliness and it implies kindness, but it also implies the encounter between the host and the visitor, which is again an encounter between unequals. And it does have this residual ring of foreignness, which doesn't go away. And crucially, this principle of hospitality might be universal, according to Kant. In other words, all states must subscribe to it and implement it. But it is nonetheless a principle of mere hospitality. And the clear implication here, and Kant actually says it very very unambiguously, is that this hospitality is not supposed to last forever, just as the visitor is not supposed to be around forever. So the state must extend hospitality to the visitor, but the state has the right to continue to treat the visitor as mere visitor, on the understanding that the visitor will leave without the state undertaking any commitments to give the visitor the right to stay for good and make this other country his or her home. This is very clear with Kant, and Kant has actually, as you know, been severely criticized by Derrida, amongst others, for not being sufficiently radical in formulating this principle of universal hospitality, and in actually refusing the visitor the right to settle and to make this other place his or her home. To his defense, historically speaking, we have to say that from a decolonial perspective, Kant was actually doing something extremely progressive, because he was implying that no one should have the right to settle permanently elsewhere. And the implication there was that colonial powers should not automatically obtain this right of conquest and of settling down elsewhere and introducing their own customs and regulations in that other place. These colonial powers, in other words, should also be treated as visitors and no more, and be expected to leave rather than establish permanent rule. So I do want us to understand here that Kant's cosmopolitan law, what he calls cosmopolitan law, does take difference as its starting point and retains this notion of difference throughout, but the way it handles difference is towards its minimization, towards diminishing its significance, while not really obliterating it and not seeking to extinguish it. And of course, as you know, Kant also appended to his essay 2 appendices in which he sets out step by step very concrete measures that should allow countries to adopt and practice this principle of universal hospitality, and should allow countries to attain and safeguard peace. And he has very particular recipes how this should be done. For example, no country should be allowed to borrow money in order to arm or rearm its standing army. Or all countries should adopt a republican form of governance. Of course, in 1796, republican didn't mean what it means today. Republican in Kant's language is any regime of governance that has a properly functioning parliament, and where the monarch no longer holds absolutist power. it's not necessarily Republican in our understanding of the word. And the insistence on all governments becoming Republican for Kant is an insistence on governments having a parliament to keep them in check, which would mean that decisions to go to declare war on another state would be much more difficult to make and pass legally. So I hope we can see now the shared territory between cultural and political cosmopolitanism, but we can see also how they diverge. The shared territory is the acceptance of this principle of difference. The divergence is how they really handle difference. And there are many points of intersection between the two, and in my examples, I'll try to flesh out some of these, but I do think there is also a crucial divergence here and non-coincidence. Think of Nazi Germany and think of the Holocaust. The Nazi Party was full of people we can definitely describe as cultural cosmopolitans, people who knew languages, who were avid readers of not just German literature, and who would listen at home not just to Wagner. And yet, many of these people in the morning would go out and they would implement the orders to kill Jews, to deprive others who are seen as foreign and different from the Aryan body of the German nation of their lives. What is more, some of them would not just implement these orders, they would actually give these orders. So, in other words, the agendas and the values of cultural and political cosmopolitanism do not always coincide. And you can be a cultural cosmopolitan without being a political cosmopolitan who extends respect to the other and recognizes his or her humanity. But let me perhaps move now to some examples that could flesh out these very rich intersections between cultural and political cosmopolitanism. And my first example today is Georg Lukács. And Georg Lukács, during his Moscow exile from 1933 until 1945, when he returned to Budapest, where he was born. And a lot of my examples today come from writers and thinkers in exile. And the problem of cosmopolitanism and exile is also something that preoccupied the book, because I don't think that exile should be seen, as it has been very often until now, as a reliable engine that produces cosmopolitan attitudes. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does the contrary. It actually exiles actually unmakes cosmopolitanism and exile casts the experience of encountering otherness in the radical light of retracing one's roots and re-embracing narrow nationalisms. Now, when Lukács arrives in Moscow in 1933, he does so as an exile who needs to flee Nazi Germany. He was in Berlin before that, because he's a communist and because he is a Jew. Lukács arrives in Moscow every bit cosmopolitan, born into a cosmopolitan family, raised with German and Hungarian simultaneously, and writing from very early on in both languages, well-traveled, steeped in this Austro-Hungarian, Central European cosmopolitan culture, and enhancing this legacy with the Marxist understanding of cosmopolitanism, which is a very political understanding of cosmopolitanism, and works out this notion of global proletarian solidarity, which, as we know, is inscribed in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. So Lukács and many others of his generation arrive in Moscow as true cosmopolitans. And they arrive in Moscow believing that they have made it not just to anyone save heaven, but they've actually made it to the capital of the world revolution, where Marx's and Engels's dream of global proletarian solidarity is bound to come true. In Moscow, Lukács writes his famous book on the young Hegel, and for which he is awarded the higher doctorate of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, of its Institute of Philosophy. And he also writes a number of very interesting articles on the theory of the novel. And in Moscow, he also writes his famous book on the historical novel, which is serialized in a Moscow journal, but could not be published at the time and had to wait until the 1950s to see the light of day in print as a book. On the surface of it, Lukács was having a good time in terms of productivity in Moscow, but below the surface, Lukács and his fellow Central European and Western exiles in Moscow were living the drama of cosmopolitans without a polis, cosmopolitans who are denied the opportunity to practice their cosmopolitanism. Because Stalin's Moscow was no longer a site of solidarity, of lived solidarity between hosts and visitors. And Stalin's Moscow was no longer the place where the principle of extending respect to the other and recognizing the humanity of your fellow human being could be implemented. Instead, Stalin's Moscow had become a place where mutual suspicion and distrust are cultivated through the work of the secret services, through the work of the party cleansing committees, through the work of the press. And Lukács and many other Central European exiles were subjected to constant following and observation and undermining, and the need to justify what they do. Lukács was all this culminated in Lukács being arrested and having to spend some time at the infamous Lubyanka, and he was amongst the luckier ones. Others were thrown out of the party or simply shot. So the cosmopolitan background and the cosmopolitan baggage with which Lukács arrived in Moscow in 1933 were vanishing during the dozen or so years that he had to spend in Moscow. And the cosmopolitan horizon to which he was accustomed and from which he was operating and writing was very fast receding. We need to understand the drama of this generation of cosmopolitan Central European communists, many of them Jewish, who arrived in Moscow believing that this would be the site of true and living cosmopolitan experience, only to find that this was the site of anything but cosmopolitanism. So you can see here how cultural cosmopolitanism founders at the utter lack of support coming from what we can term political cosmopolitanism, and how cultural cosmopolitanism in the end is powerless in the face of arrangements, political arrangements that are inclement and unpropitious to real cosmopolitanism. This is just one episode that I wanted to dwell upon in order to begin to think about the intersections of cultural and political cosmopolitanism in Europe at the time. My next example comes from the early 1920s and the work of a very interesting group of Russian intellectuals who did not accept the Russian Revolution of 1917 and decided that they should leave Russia, which they did, as hundreds of thousands of others who did not accept communism and became exiles and refugees. Now, these people called themselves Eurasians, and the very name suggests that they adopted this doctrine of collective cultural identity, whereby Russia was neither Western nor Asian. It was both, but in a way that would not commit it fully to either. Instead, Russia was this creative hybrid of the West and the East of Europe and Asia that made it stronger and superior and culturally richer to either. This doctrine is alive in various permutations and modifications to this day, actually. And if you look at the so-called Eurasian Economic Union, which was masterminded by Russia and includes a number of mostly Central Asian countries, together with Belarus and Armenia, you would see that this entire principle is very much alive. But this is not what the original Eurasians meant in the early 1920s. Now, let me just very briefly introduce these people to you. Now, clockwise, you see in the top right corner Piotr Savitsky, and they were all the same generation. So Savitsky, 1895 to 1968, an economist and geographer by education and expertise, who ended up in Prague. Then next you can see Piotr Subchinsky, 1895-1985, a musicologist who ended up in Paris, a friend of Stravinsky and Prokofiev. He also wrote a very interesting book on Stravinsky. Then you see Florovsky, 1893-1979, the only one of the four to end up in the United States, and a theologian in terms of expertise, a historian of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox doctrine. And finally, the most important of these four intellectuals, this brilliant linguist, Nikolai Trubetskoy, 1890-1938, who ended up in Vienna and who is one of the very few truly great linguists of the 20th century. His most crucial contribution to modernizing linguistics is his invention of phonology, which really modernized the way we study sounds. Because, as you know, before Trubetskoy, what people would practice, interested in sounds, was what we call phonetics, where sounds are studied from the point of view of anatomy and physics. And this is all fine, but it's a paradigm that doesn't yield very much and is now considered largely obsolete. And Trubetskoy was the first to say how the study of how sounds are articulated, or how they sound and are perceived in terms of the pitch and the quality, the other physical qualities of the sound. That's all fine, but it misses the crucial question. And the crucial question for him was how sounds are related to meaning, and how sounds could be described not according to anatomical or physical criteria, but how they can be classified with reference to their capacity to articulate different meaning. Now, before these four people parted company and went to Prague and to Paris and to the States and to Vienna, they had a brief intermediate stop of about 2 years in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. as they fled the south of Russia and before continuing on to Central and Western Europe and the United States. And this is where the Eurasian movement was founded. In my view, the most interesting work of the Eurasian movement is actually the first publication which doesn't yet mention the word Eurasia or the adjective Eurasian. And this first book was written by Nikolai Trubetskoy, and the standard English translation of 1991 has the title Europe and Mankind. I think Europe and Humanity is better, not just because mankind today sounds slightly sexist, but also because actually the Russian word человечество doesn't have this sexist male-centric ring. You can see here the original cover of the book in 1920. Now, this is an extraordinary book. You can read it in English, you can read it in German, in French, in Italian, in Russian, presumably also in Chinese. If it hasn't been translated into Chinese, I think it must be translated, because this is a short but extraordinary book in which Trubetskoy performs a brilliant critique of cosmopolitanism. And he performs a critique of cultural cosmopolitanism with political instruments, and because of the political implications and effect that cultural cosmopolitanism could have. Now, to Trubetskoy, cosmopolitanism, as he puts it, is nothing but an ideological tool in the hands of the West to pursue and perpetuate its cultural hegemony by declaring its own culture superior and thus entitled to be adopted as a model by all other non-Western cultures. Clearly here, Russia looms large in the background, but the references are not just to Russia. The references are also to various communities and various peoples in Asia. And it is really a very early manifesto of cultural decolonization. Trubetskoy has this famous sentence in this book in which he defines cosmopolitanism as the cultural chauvinism of the, as he puts it, the Romano-Germanic world. In other words, just as each nation is prone to being chauvinistic, militantly believing in its own supremacy over other nations, its own cultural, historical supremacy, so is the West. And what the West calls cosmopolitanism, to Trubetskoy, is nothing but the collective cultural chauvinism of the West. And not just the West at large, but the core parts of the West, the really powerful cultures of what he calls the Romano-Germanic world. And of course, he was thinking he is a linguist, and the reference was to the cultures that are built on the Romance and the Germanic languages, primarily French, German, and English. It is really important to understand this critique of cosmopolitanism. What Trubetskoy was critiquing here was not cosmopolitanism in itself. He was critiquing the propensity of cultural cosmopolitanism to evolve into a universalist doctrine. He was critiquing the propensity of the West to actually give up, turn its back on this crucial principle of difference, without which cosmopolitanism collapses, to erase the notion of cultural difference and to project Western culture as a legitimate, uniform model and example to be adopted by all other cultures. And look at the title of his book, Europe and Mankind. His message in the book is that until now, until his own time, 1920, the West was placing a sign of equality between Europe and mankind. Europe is mankind, and the whole of humanity, or the whole of mankind, should strive to arrive at a state of cultural identity with Europe. And what he's doing in this book, by critiquing cultural cosmopolitanism for its both cultural but also political implications and effects, was to cross out this sign of equality and to replace it by a different sign. Europe and mankind have to be seen with a sign for that signals difference. Europe is different from the humanity at large, and what is more, Europe, in terms of from the perspective of cultural diversity, and he is very clear on this, Europe has to be seen as smaller than humanity at large. I mean, we all know Dipesh Chakraborty's book of 2000, Provincializing Europe. Well, Trubetskoy was doing this work 80 years earlier with a stunning manifesto of a critique of cultural cosmopolitanism that is also a critique of Eurocentrism and an early call for decolonization. And I really, really believe that this critique of cultural cosmopolitanism by Trubetskoy also helps us to understand that cosmopolitanism as a value, as an ideal, truly is only possible so long as it recognizes and proceeds from and acknowledges difference. The minute it fails to do so, the minute it collapses the notion of difference and seeks to universalize the one particular culture or a particular group of cultures, it collapses. It becomes something else. In this case, universalism with very, very baleful political implications. Now, I wish to conclude with a part in which I will examine two more cases of the of cultural cosmopolitanism. And the first one would help me to return to the question of language, which I broached early on in the talk. This third example is centered on the work of another emigre writer who wasn't actually in exile because he didn't flee Poland. He went to Argentina officially and simply never returned because a few years after he set foot in Buenos Aires, Poland became communist, and so he stayed on in Argentina. Now, Witold Gombrowicz is a very interesting writer, and I would say he's probably firmly in the extended canon of European and world, if you will, modernism. And as you know, Deleuze has written on him and has kept the interest in his work alive in France. And Gombrowicz himself was dabbling in philosophy and has a book of philosophical conversations published posthumously. But what interests me in the case of Gombrowicz is this notion of the centrality of language for cultural cosmopolitanism. And I really want us to understand that language is absolutely central and unavoidable in any discussion of cultural cosmopolitanism. But this is not to say that, philosophically speaking, people need necessarily to be multilingual in order to be cosmopolitan. Now, here is how Gombrowicz handles this as a writer. Unlike, let's say, Nabokov, who would switch to English from Russian, and very interestingly and very indicatively, and I do think this is important if we want to discuss cultural cosmopolitanism, the first novel that Nabokov writes in English is Sebastian Night, which he writes while he is still in Paris, not in the United States. And this is a very, if you will, a very cosmopolitan experience. Someone steeped in the Russian cultural tradition, although from early on he was practically bilingual, sitting in Paris and writing a novel in English. But to return to Gombrowicz, Gombrowicz didn't do that. He didn't switch languages. He stayed with Polish. But he was a writer who clearly felt and thought and recorded this anxiety vis-a-vis narrow nationalism. And he saw his mission as a writer, as he put it in his diaries. He wrote there this great sentence. He compared him to Moses from the Old Testament, and he wrote, my mission, I see my task my mission is to lead the Poles out of their Polishness. In other words, I want my readers to begin to question their own identity, to cease to relate to their national identity as something firm and secure. And I want them to be able to relate to a wider world from a platform that is not restricted and circumscribed by this sense of unqualified and unexamined national belonging. And how did he do this as a writer? The best example here, I think, is his short novel called Transatlantic, published in 1953, and as an exile by that point, or a non-returnee, he couldn't publish this in Poland. So you can see the cover here, the first edition, published in Paris, in Polish, in one book, in one body, with a play he wrote, Schlup. Now, Transatlantic is a very strange novel from the point of view of language, because Gombrowicz wrote it in Polish that was not Polish. And this is a paradox, but it is a real lived paradox. He was adamant that this novel should be written in a language that would actually jolt, startle his fellow Poles who had stayed behind in Poland. And he was adamant that this book should be written in a language that his fellow Poles in Poland would recognize not as their own, as a language that was departing from the national language of Poland in the 1950s, the standard language that was spoken and written and read in Poland in the early 1950s. And so Gombrowicz wanted to estrange Polish from itself. And the way he did that was to write this novel in a Polish that parodically imitates the language of the late 18th and early 19th century Polish nobility. And this, of course, gives a lot of headache to any translator who wants to capture this deliberately archaic and often ironically archaic language that Gombrowicz creates here in his novel. So he was writing in a language that was both Polish and that wasn't Polish. And he was writing for an audience that he hoped, in its encounter with this novel, in that strange, self-estranged language, would begin to think of itself as both Polish and non-Polish, and would begin this journey out of its Polishness and its constraints. So this is a really, I think, a wonderful example of how cosmopolitanism could be enacted linguistically through the self-estrangement of language, without leaving the territory of one's own language, without linguistic switch, and yet by working within language to take one's flight from it. And as you know, Deleuze and Guattari in their book Kafka Towards Minor Literature, they talk about these what they term flight lines of language, and their examples are drawn from Artaud and others. But I do think that Gombrowicz practices this flight from language while staying apparently and appreciably within his own language, within Polish. So this is one of the miracles of literature, thrusting us into this very insecure, very enticing territory that keeps together these poles of identity and non-identity at the same time. And my final example today, in which I want to talk briefly about a writer who, at different points in his career as writer and intellectual, would enact and promote cultural cosmopolitanism, and then would come to write a novel of its unmaking. And at the center of this final part of my talk is, of course, Milan Kundera, another exile who was a committed communist early on, and he would leave and rejoin the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia on 2 different occasions until finally in 1968, when the Soviet tanks would roll over the streets of Prague and would brutally extinguish what is known as the reformist movement called the Prague Spring, which was an aspiration for what Dubček would call a socialism with a human face. Finally, Kundera at that point became disillusioned and together with so many other artists and intellectuals left Czechoslovakia and became an exile in France, not even in Paris. Initially, he would teach Czech language at the University of Rennes for quite a while. I mean, others who left at that point, you can think of others too. Probably the best known example in the world of cinema would be Milos Forman, the film director. Now, think again of Kant and the stranger who knocks on the door of another state without being its citizen. This was very much Kundera when he arrived in France. What is more, for a number of years, Kundera was stateless because his Czechoslovak citizenship had been rescinded and the French state had not yet granted him French citizenship. So he was really a citizen of no country, and his only option at that time was to be a citizen of the world. And in 1983, a very important polemic broke out in which mostly emigres were involved, Solzhenitsyn and Brodsky and Kundera and Czesław Miłosz. And this was a polemic on whether Central Europe existed as a culturally unique part of the world, or whether it had to be just considered as a mere appendix to the legitimate sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. At that point, Kundera wrote a really brilliant text published in the New York Review of Books, called The Tragedy of Central Europe. And if you haven't read this text, it's available online, and I would say it's very much worth reading. And Kundera mounted this passionate defense of Central Europe as a culturally unique realm and a realm of true cultural cosmopolitanism that was built on the ruins and at the confluence of three empires: the Austro-Hungarian, the German, and the Russian, and a space, cultural space, marked by this enhanced hunger and longing for the world which smaller nations tend to have. And he makes a great deal of this out of this distinction between small and large nations in this essay. But 20 years on from that essay, and we see a very different take on Central Europe in his third, and I think his best novel of the ones he's written in French, called Ignorance. It took Kundera a lot of time to begin writing novels in French, good 20 years. And this novel is a novel about a man and a woman returning from their exile and emigration, the woman from Paris, the man from Denmark, returning to Prague after the changes, after 1991, after the Velvet Revolution, in order to reacquaint themselves with their native country, and probably in order to answer for themselves the question, can we make a home out of this place once more? And through a number of episodes of bitter disillusionment, they find that this is no longer possible, and they return, each of them, Irena to Paris and Joseph to Denmark. So Prague and Central Europe in this novel are pictured as a space that is no longer cosmopolitan. It is a space where emigres and those who had stayed behind can no longer enter into a true dialogue with one another. They remain ignorant of each other's experiences and perspectives on the world. And the true encounter and the true engagement never take place. It is a novel that still retains the purely emotional abandonment to the beauty of Prague in spring, which Irena registers as she walks through the streets of Prague, reacquainting herself with the city. But it is also a novel that is brutally devoid of any illusion that Prague and Central Europe could be any more true sites of cosmopolitan encounters between different cultures and a true dialogue between different cultures. I feel I should stop here, with many thanks for your very kind patience and your interest and in anticipation of our discussion. So I will stop sharing my screen now. Let me see how I can do this. I'll stop sharing. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
For a very detailed and illuminating picture of how these two types of cosmopolitanism intersect as well as, diverge from each other. Not least because you have provided us with a Slavic perspective on this whole issue. And, who else but Professor Tihanov, who has such an extensive knowledge on Slavic literature and literatures, cultures, can do this. One of the things that you mentioned that strike me as very, very thought-provoking is the fact that cultural cosmopolitanism does not necessarily lead to political cosmopolitanism. And I think that that's something, or at least one of the insights that we need to take home with us and ruminate it on. So now I think Professor Tihanov would like to take questions. But first of all, I think we'll take questions from the audience in the room here. And then later on, questions from the online audience. So any questions? Yeah, Alex, please. Alex says, why don't you introduce yourself? Identify yourself.
Hi, Galin. I'm here.
Hello.
Alex, huh?
Yeah, Galin is my external examiner of my dissertation. So you talked very actually struck me about the cosmopolitan. I came here for my sabbatical year. Actually, I'm Alex Dakwangni from South Korea.
Hello, Alex. Yeah.
So actually, Galin is my supervisor, and then when I did my PhD, he actually did a examination of my dissertation. So I'm really influenced by his work. And then also today, your talk is quite struck me because actually I also quite interested in relationship between nationalism and cosmopolitanism, and also wrote some pieces about that. And then, but actually you open actually another way toward understanding cosmopolitanism from a different perspective. That's why I'm quite impressed by your talk today. Okay, just as you use my actually the comment and then question is related to your redefining what the cosmopolitan is, and then because in my opinion actually it's kind of the definition of cosmopolitanism, because as you said, mostly people in the field of political science or international relations, cosmopolitanism always regarded as kind of political cosmopolitanism, as a Kantian, presupposition of eternal peace, and then mostly actually against some nation state or some, nationalism. In my opinion, that the nation state might be a material foundation of a cosmopolitanism, and that is a little bit, in my opinion, kind of common sense, if you approach to this concept, and then most of the people would, regard cosmopolitanism as like a political cosmopolitanism. But you actually pointed out, that cosmopolitanism will be very aesthetic. As that is actually my impression about your talk. Is out of this kind of very the general, definition of cosmopolitanism, you put forward actually the new category of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism as a kind of linguistic practice, or you already mentioned the Deleuze and Guattari in the minor literature. In the minor literature means, kind of experimental use of literature against, which was already given by us, sort of belonging to the, territory. You would, get out of that kind of territory you're born in, and then you would actually attain a different language, and then you try to practice it in very experimental way. And then you actually gave lots of examples. That is very impressive. And so that is actually my comment when you talked about many authors practiced already, this sort of cosmopolitanism. And then, my idea is that, all right, so you pointed out Milan Kundera, at the end of your talk, but if you actually, say, the cosmopolitanism not related to the sort of political cosmopolitanism, what I mean, aesthetic practice is not really related to the kind of political cosmopolitanism. What about, the refugee? You actually talk about the cosmopolitan. We would say, many cosmopolitan writers, already, appear in the historical, the horizon. And then we would actually find out the example as well. Lots of examples you already actually mentioned. But what about the refugee? Refugee would lose their nationality, would actually exist in between different nation states, but they wouldn't have any right to reside in any territory. And then they wouldn't actually, of course, Milan Kundera didn't choose, he gonna stay, in between, actually he didn't actually decide he gonna be the citizen of the world, but the citizen of the world would be, forced by this situation in which you cannot, obtain any nationality. And then in that case, how could we actually, connect this ontological, the refugee ontology to when you, talk about in terms of aesthetic cosmopolitanism or cultural, cosmopolitanism? That's my question.
Galin, we'll take two more questions and then you can answer them, all together, all at once. Any other questions? Lilith, I thought you were going to ask a question. No? Oh, Manuel? Yeah, okay, yes.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. My question is half form, so I apologize in advance for that. My name is Manuel Herrero. I'm assistant professor here at Foreign Languages and Literatures at National Taiwan University. And I was really interested with the example of the Polish writer Gombrowicz, who wrote this novel in this purposefully archaic or antiquated register. And I'm just wondering if you have, my main area is American literature. So I was trying to think of examples of writers doing the same thing in an American context. And I really couldn't come up with any. I could come up with the turn to regionalism in American literature when Mark Twain and others start to bring dialect as a sort of a new national identity or a sort of fragmentation that is not cosmopolitan, but that brings a kind of inner diversity. So I was just interested in if you have other examples in the Slavic European context of writers doing the same, bringing the regional, the dialectal, the local as a kind of antidote to this cultural cosmopolitanism.
Okay. Thank you, Manuel. Lilith, yes?
Hello, I'm Lilith Acadia. I'm also an assistant professor in this department. And during your talk, I was reflecting on my own first impressions of cosmopolitanism from taking a course with Nalini Bhushan, where the emphasis was really on cosmopolitanism as morally defined. So cosmopolitan centered around expanding the moral reference and our responsibilities beyond our own society. So a more morality-based definition similar to the one that you proposed at the beginning. And I was very curious what you might think morality's role is in moderating between the cultural and the political cosmopolitanisms, because this could either be a place I'm imagining, where there could be a way of reuniting them over shared moral goals, or a way that it is further, the difference is further entrenched. So if you would like to comment on the role of morality in the cosmopolitanisms that you see, that would be great.
Okay, Galin.
Okay, thank you very much for these very good questions. I'll take them in reverse order. And you see, what we call moral cosmopolitanism is very important. It is important for Kant. It is important for all these people writing in the 1990s and beyond. But in my view, I call this second type of cosmopolitanism that I talked today about political cosmopolitanism, because I believe it subsumes what we call moral cosmopolitanism. And it subsumes it in a way such as to recognize this as its foundation, probably its ultimate goal, as you suggested, but without the political infrastructure, this moral cosmopolitanism remains unimplementable and unrealistic proposition. Particularly if we want to take this notion of the moral imperative beyond the individual encounters between individual human beings. And I return here to the distinction between cultural and political cosmopolitanism. Cultural cosmopolitanism sees the principal agent of cultural cosmopolitanism in the individual. Political cosmopolitanism works with collectivities, with larger bodies such as the state, and it is really important to recognize this, because what we call moral cosmopolitanism, to me, is only a part of this political cosmopolitanism that has to be extended beyond the privacy of encounters between individuals. And there, the political is at stake, because notions of power, notions of infrastructure are really becoming important. I still think we have this background noise, probably not muted, and I hope you hear me. So I hope this goes some way to answering your question. Yes, the moral spectrum is extremely important. In a sense, it is the ultimate goal for Kant and many others, but it cannot be separated from the legal basis, from the work of this cosmopolitan law that requires consensus on how states regulate their affairs and what legislation they adopt and what form of government they choose to adhere to. Now, the other question, you know, Europe is full of examples of deliberately antiquated or deployment of deliberately antiquated language, and not just in the Slavic realm, also in German literature, on which I work just as much as I do on Russian and Eastern European. But this opens up this larger question of what we call the disposition narrative disposition in parodically engaging with other linguistic and stylistic registers. And archaism is just one of these the targets of its disposition. You can just as easily enact an encounter in a modern work of literature with aspects of orality, building into your narrative dispositions that seek to reenact secondary orality. There is this interesting. I think the background noise is becoming almost overwhelming, but I will write I will write, it's much better now, thank you. I write this in the chat. There is this interesting Russian literary theorist called Boris Eichenbaum, who offered this category, this term called skas. And skas is all about how modern literature reenacts a secondary reality. And very often as part of this, also regional language, archaic language, and so on, as a particular aesthetic disposition. So examples could be drawn from across European literatures. You can read, for example, this great Russian storyteller, Nikolai Leskov, and this is very much what he does. And he's not, by far not the only one. Now this takes me to Alex's very important question. And I hasten to say here that all this literature on political cosmopolitanism in the 1990s and early in the 21st century, it was a response largely to globalization and what the left, particularly the left of not exactly Marxist but social democratic provenance, would see as the effects of globalization. So if you read Ulrich Beck or David Hill, this is very, very evident there. Global cosmopolitanism is a way of mildering and attenuating the effects of globalization, either the acceleration of inequality or somehow taming dangers of the global risk society. But during that time, there is also some interesting work. They don't call it cultural cosmopolitanism. I call it cultural cosmopolitanism, but it engages with what we can call cosmopolitanism as a lifestyle, and what I call cosmopolitanism from below, rather than the other form of cosmopolitanism from above, which is always political cosmopolitanism. Habermas speaks for it, and Habermas imagines, I think utopically, that the United Nations somehow rationally impose and legislate for political cosmopolitanism. Now, this other body of work, cosmopolitanism is a lifestyle inspired by Raymond Williamson, cultural studies, and so on. We talk about fashion, shopping as legitimate forms of cosmopolitanism. And here I come to your question, refugees. Now, I think there is a danger here, and I will take this danger, I've written about this a little bit already, precisely in this body of work of the 1990s and the early 21st century that comes from social anthropology, and that would seek to cast these refugees not as precarious human beings that live a life of liminality, constantly dogged by the police and constantly in danger of being thrown out and be exposed as undocumented citizens. There is this strange, and I say strange as a form of protest against this way of thinking, a strange body of work that seeks to see refugees not as this endangered human beings, but as I use this term that comes from this kind of work as cosmopolitans who develop this form of what one of these sociologists calls enforced cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism that is somehow practiced by these refugees on a daily basis as they try, for example, to smell without having a license to do so, to peddle illegally imported goods in the markets of Barcelona or Berlin or London. Now, sociologists and social anthropologists would refer to this as a cosmopolitan experience because all these poor and very precariously living refugees have somehow developed a cosmopolitan toolkit of engaging with the buyers in a number of languages, with the acute awareness to the habits, and customs, and tastes of all these tourists that are traversing the streets of Barcelona and Berlin and miraculously, these terribly curious human beings are cast as cosmopolitans. I think this is wrong. And I think this is wrong politically, morally, because all these questions of precarity and inequality appear to vanish this act of miraculously endowing these refugees with the markers of a cosmopolitan existence. So this is what I would say in answer to this question.
Thank you, Melanie.
Questions from
Questions from me. Let me read them out to the audience. Okay. The two questions on the internet. First is, which city or country in the world today do you think can best accommodate the spirit of cultural cosmopolitanism? And question two, intrigued by language as a constitutive component of cultural cosmopolitanism, multilingual capacities certainly empower individuals to conduct cross-cultural communication. But how could a single language alone create a self-estrangement experience? Thank you.
Yes. Now, these two questions are interlinked in many ways. And in answer to the first question, philosophically speaking, any place could accommodate the spirit of cultural cosmopolitanism, and there is no reason why one place should be privileged over another place. Kant, you would recall, was living his entire life in a small place, Königsberg. It was at the time part of Prussia, and is now part of Russia, an outpost of Russia. And he would sometimes be accused of not taking part in the larger world. And he would say, I don't need to go anywhere else to be interested in the larger world. Königsberg is a port city on the Baltic Sea, and I can see all these sailors disembarking here, and they give me sufficient material to observe other cultures and other habits and other customs. But I also want to extend my response a little bit and say that when it comes to cultural cosmopolitanism, as I tried to show in my lecture, it could also be practiced and enacted and materialized under totalitarian regimes. So totalitarian countries could be places where cultural cosmopolitanism could unfold and be enacted just as much as in democracies. And this is something, this difficult territory is something that writing on political cosmopolitanism in the late 90s and in the 21st century from this liberal Western perspective would entirely miss and neglect. So this is a very difficult territory, but we need to work with this distinction and non-coincidence between cultural and political cosmopolitanism. So in other words, you don't need to be in Paris or in Johannesburg or in Tokyo to live this spirit of cosmopolitanism. And this takes me to the second question. Actually, this experience of self-estrangement becomes accessible to each one of us as we read novels and poems, even in translation. Literature has this capacity of expanding our inner selves and of creating all experiences and giving us experiences alternative to our own. And it can do this also in translation. So the translation gives us access to all these alternative experiences that would question our own, that would stimulate us to begin to see our own frame of reference as not necessarily natural, let alone universal. And literature has its own ways of doing this, even in translation, which takes us to this question of what constitutes literariness and how is the effect of fictionality produced. And a great deal of this effect of fictionality and conditionality is produced in ways that could be accounted for not just on the level of the language in which the work was originally written, because literariness travels also in translation. Its aesthetic effects remain often recognizable also in translation, particularly fictional prose. And I write a little bit about this in my book, The Birth and Death of Literary Theory, especially in the epilogue. So I would definitely say that monolingualism is not actually, philosophically speaking, theoretically speaking, a barrier to cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is, of course, enhanced by or multilingualism, but it doesn't need to be precluded by the absence of other languages.
Yes, thank you, Galin. As we are running out of time, and we just like to really thank you again for getting up so early in order to be with us. And again, this is an interesting, informative, as well as enlightening talk. And we've learned so much from you, and I guess the audience would say the same too. Last but not least, I hope to someday, very soon, to meet you again physically. Meanwhile, please take care and stay in touch. Thank you very much. And thank you, the audience, for attending. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And my renewed thanks to all of you and to Professor Sebastian Liao, and for those who took part in the discussion, and to our two colleagues who rehearsed the connection with me yesterday. I'm very much in your debt. Thank you for your hospitality. It's been a real pleasure.